Lucius Cornelius Cinna, Praetor 44 BCE. The son of the leader of the popular faction for much of the 80s, Cinna's name alone should have been enough to ensure a high level of political success. After evading would-be assassins during Sulla's proscriptions, Cinna went on to fight for Lepidus in 78 before going to Spain to serve under Sertorius. Even after Quintus Sertorius was assassinated in 73, Cinna was able to continue to evade the Sullan order. It was only in 70, due in part to the support of his brother-in-law Gaius Julius Caesar, that Cinna was finally able to return home. However, Cinna's return would not be a sweet one, as he was debarred from ever holding public office. While his prime years passed him by, he was forced to watch from the sidelines as a private citizen, while the boys he grew up with went on to become the men of action of their day. His brother-in-law, Julius Caesar, in the meantime, divorced his sister, and went on to achieve greatness, reaching the consulship in 59 before going on to conquer Gaul and ensure an indelible place in history. It was only in 49, after Caesar crossed the Rubicon and became dictator, that he acted to allow the uncle of his only child to finally partake in what he regarded as his birthright. By 44, Cinna was a praetor, and perhaps within a few years he could rise to the consulship under Caesar's patronage. However, when Caesar was killed before his very eyes at the theater of Pompey, Cinna surprised the assassins and outraged the public by congratulating the killers and celebrating the death of a man he called a tyrant. When he dramatically cast aside the robes of his office and denounced Caesar before the public, Cinna incited a riot. In the aftermath of his speech, after which he was far and away the least popular man in Rome, both the assassins and the Caesarians were able to take the temperature of the time, and this very much paved the path to the general amnesty and the decision to uphold all of Caesar's acts and appointments. Here we will focus both on the impact of Cinna's speech and try to figure out why he felt and acted the way that he did on the Ides of March. As was often the case in Roman society, Cinna bore the same exact name as his father, the famous Lucius Cornelius Cinna from the 80s. Gaius Marius had come into conflict with Sulla after the Social War, and in many ways, because of Marius's advanced age, he was little more than a figurehead for the movement, which was actually controlled by the elder Cinna. Cinna had always been the political mastermind behind it and behind the popular faction, and this became much more explicit after Marius died in 87. Cinna then went on to hold 4 back-to-back consulships between 87 and 84, and in this capacity was the leader of the popular party and of a rival government with that of Sulla, who was in the east at the time. The elder Cinna died early in 84 when his troops mutinied as he was trying to lead them into the Balkans to face Sulla. After this point, leadership fell upon Carbo, and of course he was ultimately defeated by Sulla. As for the younger Cinna, he was born sometime between 100 and 95, with 100 being the most likely date, and that would make him an exact contemporary of Gaius Julius Caesar, his future brother-in-law. When both men were about 15, so before they were really men, except in the legal Roman sense, Caesar married Cinna's sister. Famously, Cinna's sister would be the subject of Caesar's first famous public act. When Sulla came home, he demanded that Caesar show his political allegiance by divorcing Cinna's sister and marrying someone more suitable, but Caesar famously refused. He remained wed to Cornelia, and in time Cornelia would give birth to Julia, Caesar's only child. Due to his youth, young Cinna played very little part, at least no noted part in our sources, during the civil war with Sulla. There's a good chance that he fought in the front lines somewhere as an 18-year-old, but certainly he was not old enough to warrant any kind of major command. Most likely he was also put on the proscription list. After all, he was the son of, well, the adult son now of the leader of the rival faction, and he managed to give the headhunters the slip until he was able to procure a pardon. Most likely, like many of the people who were pardoned, he managed to have an intermediary who went to Sulla on his behalf and either offered a bribe or played up some family connection to get him off the list. Even before Sulla was dead, his faction was beginning to come unglued, and once he was room temperature, the rivalry between the two consuls Marcus Aemilius Lepidus and Catulus boiled over into an open civil war. This was a complicated series of events and one that I will cover in much greater detail when I look at Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, but for now I'd just like to highlight the role of the younger Cinna. Lepidus launched a revolt which started in Etruria, where there were plenty of dispossessed and angry farmers who had lost their land to Sulla's veterans. They wanted their land back, and Lepidus decided to be their champion. He also wanted to recruit supporters of the former Marian faction, who were still numerous despite the deaths of many of their leaders. So, for that reason alone, Cinna the Younger joining him was a diplomatic coup. Bearing the name of a man who had led the faction for several years, Cinna could provide pretty good recruitment, one would think, despite his youth and lack of official rank. However, Lepidus was defeated by Pompey the Great, among others, and when he retreated to regroup on Sardinia, he ended up dying, and this left his followers, including Cinna, without a clear place to go. However, they all decided to go and join Sertorius, knowing that they couldn't put themselves into the hands of the boy butcher Pompey or the consul Catulus, so they all went to Spain under the leadership of the senior man amongst them, Marcus Perperna. We don't know anything about Cinna's time in Spain because he just was not senior enough to warrant mention in our sources. However, we can infer that he was present in Spain, and he may have even been present and party to Perperna's murder of Sertorius. Now, that last part is a little bit unlikely since Perperna, as part of his betrayal of Sertorius, was allowed to come back to Rome by Metellus Pius and Pompey, whereas Cinna remained in hiding after the death of Sertorius, which implies that he remained loyal and that Perperna's treachery was something that he had no part in. By the year 70, Roman politics settled into a period of relative calm, at least for a short time. By this point, not only had Sertorius been defeated, but so had the slave revolt of Spartacus. Italy was once again not under arms. Pompey and Crassus were consuls, and the two of them, despite the bitterness of their rivalry, were not going to fight a civil war with one another. Pompey, in part to gain an edge over Crassus and in part to show his generosity and the full extent of his greatness that he was now claiming, wanted to push for a general amnesty to allow all of the exiles of the various conflicts of the last decade and a half or so to come home. And so this was something that he pushed for, and some of the politicians who supported him were therefore eager to take up that cause. One of them was the tribune Plautius, who also was an ally of Gaius Julius Caesar. And Plautius would be the tribune who would push the motion that allowed everyone who had been banished under Lepidus and Sertorius to finally come home and enjoy their property. There was, however, a poison pill, and the poison pill is that despite the general amnesty, all of the men who had served under Lepidus and Sertorius would be debarred from holding public office. Here is where the potential rivalry that would emerge between Caesar and Cinna may have originated. Because Caesar was a major backer of Plautius and had some role in the drafting of this legislation, there's a possibility that he was the one who wanted to push for all the returning exiles to be banned from public office. But why? Well, it's quite simple, actually. In the absence of Cinna the Younger, Caesar was the natural inheritor of the leadership of the Populares, as they were now known. Gaius Marius the Younger had died earlier during the fighting with Sulla, as had Marius's nephew Gratidianus. And so the next biggest name would be Cinna the Younger. If you can keep Cinna the Younger out of office, then at that point you have to turn to someone who was more tangentially related, say a nephew by marriage like Julius Caesar. So whether this was the case or whether Cinna simply suspected it, this could be a source of great resentment on his part toward his brother-in-law. It was shortly after this time when Cinna returned that Caesar would divorce Cornelia and move on to his second wife. Was this a way to get rid of Cinna, or did Caesar genuinely try to fight for his brother-in-law and fail, and then leave his sister because, well, the marriage alliance no longer had value since Cinna the Younger no longer had a political future? We don't know, but I think there's at least a good chance that Caesar knew that Cinna the Younger would be too much of a threat for leadership of the faction, and so rather than having a potentially dangerous ally, he chose instead to leave the field of the populares relatively open. From the time of his father's death until his return from exile, Cinna the Younger had had quite an eventful, momentous life. But then, between 70 and 49, we have not a single reference to the man. Presumably he lived in Rome, but beyond that we can say very little. It's very apparent, however, that he was not involved in politics, at least not in any direct capacity. He must have married at some point prior to his long exile, since he did have an adult son named Lucius Cornelius Cinna, who would be an office holder by the year 44. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon and took Rome, one of his early acts was to end the prohibition on office holding that had kept all of the returned exiles out of office. And the most famous beneficiary, really the only beneficiary I can name, is Cinna the Younger. In 46, Cinna married Pompey's widowed daughter, Pompeia Magna. This union, despite Cinna's advancing years, would bear a son who would go on to become consul many, many years later. During the civil war between Caesar and Pompey and then Pompey's various successors, we don't really know what Cinna was up to, but given that Caesar had put him in the Senate in 49 and had appointed him praetor for 44, there's a very good chance that Cinna was on Caesar's side. Because of his advanced age, or advancing age at least, and his lack of previous office holding, he would not have been very useful as a unit commander, and so most likely he was in Rome doing his small part as a junior magistrate to advance Caesar's cause. Or perhaps doing even less than that, it's unclear. 44 in general should have been a great year for the Cinna household, because Cinna was now praetor, and his son and namesake was now quaestor. So two members of the same family who had been largely frozen out of politics for a few decades at this point were now prominently featured in the Caesarian order. Life had gotten better, even if it was not quite the way that Cinna had planned. Before we examine Cinna's actions on March 15th to 20th of 44 BCE, I would first like to examine his possible motives. What was his attitude toward his former brother-in-law, Julius Caesar? And why did he feel that way? Earlier in the video, I speculated that there's a very good chance either that Caesar did rig Claudius's law to exclude people like Cinna, or that perhaps Cinna felt that this was the case even when it wasn't. If so, that in itself would very much explain Cinna's resentment, as he had missed his entire career effectively due to Caesar's machinations. That being said, it could be even more simple than that. Perhaps Cinna didn't think that Caesar was to blame at all, in any capacity, for what had happened to him, but rather was simply jealous. After all, Cinna had gone through hell as a young man to fight for his cause, for the Popularis faction. He not only had seen his own father get murdered, but then he had fought against Sulla. He had managed to stay safe from Sulla's headhunters. He had then gone to fight under Lepidus and served in Spain under Sertorius. He had done all of these things, which showed his deep commitment to the cause, and yet he had nothing to show for it, whereas his brother-in-law Caesar, who had stayed behind in Rome, had not helped Lepidus, and had not gone to help Sertorius, had become the face of a movement that he had not made nearly enough sacrifices for in Cinna's eyes. However, another possible motive that a number of modern scholars support is that Cinna, despite his political heritage, was actually a dedicated supporter of the Senate, and this is actually possible. For starters, we don't know that Cinna the Elder was even all that radical in the grand scheme of things, and certainly Lepidus wasn't in 78, and so there's a very good chance that Cinna thought that the republic of his youth was one that was worth restoring, and that Caesar had done more than anyone else to undermine that republic's credibility. So it is possible that Cinna was someone who, despite his heritage and where his personal interests stood, was politically aligned with the people he had actually sided against during the Civil War. That being said, I feel like the motives were much more personal and were based upon resentment and possible suspicion that Caesar had plotted to keep him out of public life in order to enhance his own standing. By March of 44 BCE, Caesar had relaxed his security precautions and no longer thought of himself as being under any immediate threat of assassination. After all, he had made political appointments, he had pardoned all of his foes, and he was about to depart for Parthia. So he really had little to worry about so far as he knew. And so he scheduled a meeting of the Senate on March 15th, 44 BCE at the Theater of Pompey, one of the best remaining meeting places for the Senate following the destruction of the Senate House back in the 50s. The only people to show up early were Caesar and the plotters. Now, normally, senators were not super eager to get there as early as humanly possible, but Caesar was a workaholic, so of course he was guaranteed to show up early, and the plotters were there under the guise of needing to petition him in regard to someone who still was in exile. There were 4 other men present who had no idea what they were about to witness. One of them was Cato's friend Favonius. Favonius, for whatever reason, had been considered and rejected as a potential confederate in the plot. Most likely he was either a dipshit or a drunk. Another man who was present and who was considered for membership in the plot but ultimately passed over because of his lack of physical courage was the great orator Marcus Tullius Cicero. Another man was Dolabella, the consul designate for the part of 44 after Caesar's upcoming departure. And finally, the last man present was Caesar's former brother-in-law, the Praetor Lucius Cornelius Cinna. Cinna's reasons for being this early are unclear. It may have been simple happenstance, or perhaps he had business to take care of himself, or we don't really know. What Cinna would witness would be something that he clearly did not wake up expecting: the murder of Caesar by 20-something conspirators. We don't know what his immediate reaction was, and most likely the conspirators were focused on Caesar rather than on his ex-brother-in-law. However, within minutes, most likely, of the assassination, Cinna made it clear that he was all in with the conspirators and that he thought that they had done right. Right after the conspirators were finished slaying Caesar, Cicero is recorded as having walked up to them to congratulate them, and then inquire as to why they didn't invite him into the conspiracy. One has to imagine Cinna did much the same thing, albeit with more vim and vigor. Not only did Cinna want to congratulate the conspirators, he wanted to actively aid them and make it known to the entirety of Rome that he supported their actions. Whatever their plan had been, it was clear that the Roman public was going to be a problem. After all, many of them had benefited from Caesar's actions, especially the various Caesarian veterans who were in Rome at the time. So, Brutus and Cassius had not really thought through that part of their plan unless their plan was to die, or to face at least putting their lives on the line and maybe or maybe not escaping. Cinna, therefore, came in as a kind of savior. They hadn't been planning on this, but Cinna was someone who perhaps could reach out to the people. He was a praetor who owed his office to Caesar. He was Caesar's former brother-in-law, so he couldn't be said to be some sort of personal enemy, and so perhaps he'd be persuasive. Another factor to consider is that the conspirators were very rank conscious, just like the Pompeians before them. They very much believed in inherited rank and status to a degree that went beyond what most Romans, who were typically really into those things, believed. And so, because Cinna was the son of the popular leader Cinna, the thought was that he would have some natural and undeniable cachet with the Caesarian troops. What the conspirators perhaps failed to consider is that Cinna had been a very minor figure for the last 5 years and a complete non-entity before that. However many deeds he had performed in his youth were long forgotten, or the people who might remember them were dead. We don't know exactly what happened next. Our sources are at a bit of a variance. In one account, Cinna went out with Brutus and Cassius and spoke on their behalf while they stood by him. In another account that's a little more likely, the conspirators all managed to hole up on the Capitol while Cinna went out to address the people, and the idea was to protect the conspirators while Cinna went out to do PR for them and hopefully ensure their safety. Cinna was given a respectful hearing, as people were shocked at the death of Caesar in this way. And hearing from one of Caesar's associates in this way could have been calming, except that Cinna decided that he too must do something dramatic. And in order to show that he thought the dictator was entirely illegitimate and that all of his actions were illegitimate, Cinna decided to make the first sacrifice on behalf of liberty. He removed his praetor's robes and tossed them to the ground contemptuously, saying that he could not truly be praetor if the office came from an illegitimate source like Caesar. In Appian's account, nothing happened after this insult, but the people boiled about it privately before eventually exploding. However, in Plutarch's telling, which in this case is more likely, the crowd exploded into violence immediately, and Cinna was forced to flee for his life. From this point forward, for at least the next week, if not longer, Cinna was actually the most hated man in Rome, and he hadn't even borne a dagger. One of the best reasons for supposing that Plutarch was correct and Appian was wrong about the crowd's reaction to Cinna's speech is that the following day, Brutus referenced the riot that ensued after Cinna's speech and gave that as a reason for why he and the other conspirators were not yet willing to leave the refuge of the Capitol. So, taking Brutus's concerns into consideration, Antony and Lepidus began to negotiate with the conspirators and eventually came to an agreement. This agreement was actually mostly forged by Lepidus. Lepidus was clearly the most important figure in this process, as he commanded the legion which had come into town to reestablish order. Lepidus was also one of the senior men in the Caesarian faction, and someone who had a lot of experience at administration, particularly in Rome. Another asset that Lepidus had was that his son was also the nephew of Brutus. So Lepidus was able to use the familial connection to negotiate more directly with Brutus, and this led to an agreement where Antony and Lepidus sent their oldest sons to serve as hostages and later to escort Brutus and Cassius down from the Capitol. Other senators offered their sons to the other conspirators. The next meeting of the Senate would occur on March 17th at the Temple of Tellus, near Antony's home. Lepidus's men were slated to provide security to make sure the crowd nearby didn't get out of hand. The men under arms were generally under discipline, whereas the Caesarian veterans in town who were not currently under the standards were not bound by any such discipline. The biggest issue the Senate would have to deal with was what to do about Caesar's appointments and decrees. Some, especially the assassins, felt that all of them should be overturned as being illegal. Others, however, had personally benefited from them, or feared that the overthrow of all of these appointments and laws would lead to anarchy. After all, if all the current officials were appointed by Caesar and they were all illegitimate, then what does one do to get back to a lawful government? One of the strongest signs that the Senate had received from the public in terms of what they should do about this was that Cinna's effort at getting rid of his robes of office had met with a riot. So the Senate knew that some degree of caution was necessary. So while there might be some people in the Senate who would speak and call for all of Caesar's actions and appointments to be overturned, that simply was not going to happen because of what had nearly happened to Cinna a few days before. We have no way to know what Cinna intended when he cast aside his praetor's robes and denounced Caesar. Was this a political gesture in order to test the waters for getting rid of all of Caesar's various acts and appointments? Or, as I think, was it simply an expression of his pent-up resentment after so many years, and a dramatic way to finally come out and say what he really thinks about Gaius Julius Caesar? We'll never know. But regardless of his intention, he did show that the public still very much revered the memory of Caesar, and that the Senate would have to maneuver very cautiously in order to prevent a large-scale riot. Strauss believes that much of the resentment that Caesar's veterans had come to feel towards Cinna was not so much about the specific things he had said, but rather about his general ingratitude to his patron, Caesar. If this is the case, then Cinna would have been mortified to know that anyone considered him in need of a patron, since of course he was a Roman senator born to the aristocracy. But I think the explanation is actually simpler than that. Caesar was beloved by the public, and right after his death, while they're all in shock and mourning, a man comes along and is effectively pissing on his grave, yet to be dug. That's really what it boils down to, at least in my mind. At any rate, Cinna was still on people's minds, and they were not thinking of inviting him over for dinner, but rather killing him. While he was walking to this meeting at the Temple of Tellus, he once again had donned his praetor's robes. Perhaps he was thinking, well, maybe we should uphold Caesar's acts and appointments. Being praetor isn't that bad. Or perhaps he thought that the crowd would see that he was apologetic because he had taken the robes back up, so maybe he had spoken too harshly, and he now understood that this was not something that the public wanted. At any rate, though, the public found his donning of the Praetorian robes that he had denounced as another insult. And so when they saw him, whether they would have done this or not had he been dressed otherwise, they decided to attack him, and the men attacking him were Caesar's veterans. They pelted him with stones, and he was mildly wounded. He ran away and took refuge in a local house, and the men outside, who couldn't get indoors to finish him off, instead decided to burn down the house and Cinna with it. However, before that could occur, Lepidus and his veterans showed up and rescued Cinna from this potential death by immolation. We don't know after this if Cinna went on to attend the Senate or went for medical attention, but at any rate, it was now clear that he was somehow the most hated man in Rome, despite having stabbed Caesar 0 times, whereas there were 20+ men who had all stabbed him at least once. It's quite incredible to think about, just how much he pissed off the public by the simple act of removing his robes and calling the dead Caesar illegitimate. The Senate ultimately decided to both pardon the assassins and to uphold all of Caesar's acts and appointments. It was an odd compromise, and this didn't really satisfy Caesar's veterans. While they were happy to see Caesar's will upheld and to see the benefactions go out, they weren't satisfied because their great patron remained unavenged. Apparently, Antony at first had thought the public would want peace, but sensing that the public actually wanted vengeance, he decided to change direction. On March 20th, Antony delivered Caesar's eulogy, and he took the occasion to stir up the crowd. He posed as Caesar's principal heir and champion, and managed to inflame the crowd's anger. The crowd wanted blood for their beloved leader who had fallen, and so a massive riot broke out. In the words of Shakespeare, Antony's closing line to his speech was, "Cry havoc, and let slip the dogs of war." This, of course, could presage the year and a half that would follow of warfare between Antony, the Caesarians, and the assassins. But it also could have just described that very day, because while Lepidus's men were busy trying to manage security, there was only a legion or two available, and Lepidus decided to focus on protecting the homes of his political allies. So Lepidus and Antony's homes were well protected, as were those of other Caesarian senators. However, they didn't really bother trying to protect the lives or property of the various conspirators. This, of course, heavily implies that Lepidus knew what Antony was going to do, approved of it, and made his preparations accordingly. Famously, the crowd leaving Antony's oration were eager to get their hands on people who were responsible for Caesar's death, and one of their targets was none other than Lucius Cornelius Cinna, who was still the most hated man in Rome, just 5 days after having cast his robes on the ground. They did end up finding a man named Cinna, but this was Helvius Cinna, the unrelated tribune who was a die-hard Caesarian and a poet. And one has to imagine that as a tribune, Helvius Cinna was most likely in his early 30s, so considerably older than the 55-year-old Cinna. Nonetheless, the crowd thought that they had gotten Cinna, and they proudly paraded his head through the streets. At some point, someone must have noticed that this was the wrong Cinna, but it didn't really matter. The rioters also managed to burn down a house or two, but for the most part, the fact remained that Cinna had actually suffered more physical harm than any of the actual conspirators up to this point. In late November 43 BCE, Lepidus, Antony, and Octavian would form the Second Triumvirate. After having been pitted against one another to some extent by the Senate, the three of them got together and decided that as the remaining principal leaders of the Caesarian cause, they would band together, avenge Caesar's death, and govern the Roman world. Each of them, as part of this agreement, decided to proscribe their opponents. And part of the proscription list would be that each one of them was expected to sacrifice someone near to them who was offensive to one of their new peers. We don't know for sure if Cinna was near or dear to any of them, but he certainly was proscribed, and his estate was confiscated. Another part of the proscription that people have pointed out is that it was used to raise money to pay off the massive horde that they now had under arms and that they were about to lead east to face Brutus and Cassius. If anyone among the triumvirs was a friend of Cinna, it had to be Lepidus. Lepidus was generally well-liked, so far as we know, and also he saved Cinna during his moment of need on March 17th. That being said, it's possible that Lepidus would have saved anyone in that situation, as there was a mood of reconciliation among the senators right after the Ides of March, and what better way to show a spirit of unity than for Lepidus, Caesar's right-hand man, to go rescue a man who had so publicly and viciously denounced Caesar's legacy. Cinna, of course, had shown that not only did he have a long history of avoiding headhunters, but he could also evade death when it came to him by a mob. So, unsurprisingly, the various headhunters of 43 and 42 BCE apparently failed to find and kill him and collect their reward. However, we know that over the next few years he did in fact die. Now, whether he died of natural causes is unknown, but most likely he died because of violence. So most likely he took part in one of the various battles after the formation of the Second Triumvirate. Perhaps he went east and fought at Philippi on the half of Cassius or Brutus. We don't know. But Cinna, after a long life of adventure, was finally dead within just a couple years of the formation of the Second Triumvirate. At heart, the story of Lucius Cornelius Cinna is, as I've argued, a story about resentment and thwarted ambition. This was a man who grew up believing, and rightfully so, that one day he would be one of the chief men in Rome. That never happened despite all of his youthful exploits, and despite sticking very firm to his principles. Arguably, not only because of his youthful deeds, but because of his family name, he may have had a stronger claim to the leadership of the Populares than did Julius Caesar. Especially once Gaius Marius the Younger and Gratidianus were off the scene. And because of that, the younger Cinna has a very interesting case for being one of the top candidates for a what-if scenario. His career could have been quite fascinating, and having him as one of the participants in Roman politics during his prime years may have very much changed everything. Cinna is interesting as well because he ended up suffering more physical abuse than the two men who were once part of the assassination plot, that is to say, the men who were originally targets, Lepidus and Antony, who ultimately were spared by the assassins. And he also suffered less harm than any of the 20-something conspirators who murdered Caesar. His gesture of throwing down his toga was perhaps the most impactful in a negative way gesture in Roman history. No one else earned so much hatred so quickly. And the irony, of course, is that Cinna, because of the trials and travails of his life, was someone who could be a subject of empathy. And yet instead, as his resentment boiled over while he was addressing the people, he ended up becoming public enemy number one. So his suffering led to more suffering, ultimately. As for the fates of Cinna's various descendants, his oldest son and namesake, Lucius Cornelius Cinna, probably became suffect consul in 32 BCE. That would be fairly in keeping with the practice of Octavian, who was prone to allow his old rival sons to rise to high office. And his son, Gnaeus Cornelius Cinna Magnus, the son he had by Pompeia Magna late in life, would go on to have an absolutely fascinating career, as he would be full consul in 5 CE, after, before that, having tried to kill Augustus. And not only did he become consul after being spared, but he even became a part of Augustus's inner circle. How exactly he pulled that off, I'm still not sure, but that's something I definitely plan to cover one day. If you're interested in learning more about the differences in Cinna's actions between the accounts of Appian and Plutarch, not only can you consult those primary sources, Plutarch in this case, we're talking about the life of Caesar, the life of Antony, and with Appian we're talking about the Civil War. But if you want a scholarly article that covers it, there is something written by John Moles in 1987 that you can actually access by Wikipedia if you go to the article on Cinna, and then you look at the footnotes and click one of the links. It will take you right to the article, and you don't even have to have JSTOR access to see it. So I highly recommend that you do that if you're interested in learning more about this man and the controversy surrounding his actions on the Ides of March in 44 BCE. Until next time, and there will be many, many more times because we obviously have many more figures to cover, I'm Thersites the Historian, and I beg of you to not put a dagger in me if you ever see me on March 15th. Goodbye.